Hello and welcome to another episode of This is Australia. Today it's a special day. It's a historic day. It's Anzac Day. Today we remember the enormous sacrifice from hundreds of thousands of Australians and New Zealanders. And we're also going to look what happened after the Australians and New Zealanders they were defeated by the Turks. But first let's have a look how it all started. So what happened? Why we had to sacrifice 250,000 lives. Let's have a look.
But first, the Navy would have to force its way through the Dardanelles Strait. On the 18th of March 1915, a combined French and British fleet attacked the straits. The Turkish guns survived the naval bombardment. The Allied ships were sitting ducks. 3 battleships were sunk that day. 3 crippled, 4 damaged. The Allies lost over 700 men. The Allies tried again. This time, the Navy would support an amphibious landing of troops. The Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, known as Anzacs, joined French and British soldiers. On the 25th of April 1915, 70,000 Allied troops went ashore on the peninsula of Gallipoli. The Anzacs were landed in the wrong place. 8,000 men struggled ashore on a narrow strip of sand hemmed in by steep hills. The men christened it Anzac Cove. Breaking out of Anzac Cove, the casualties soared. New Zealander William Malone blamed the folly and incompetence of Australian officers. The Turks contained the Anzac breakout at the Cove. The British landing at V Beach went badly. The plan was to run the ship River Clyde onto the shore, her hold no longer full of coal, but men. But she went aground further out, exposing the British to withering Turkish fire.
The enemy commanders were sending the men down the ramps. But they could not escape the Turkish bullets. The shore at V Beach was full of enemy corpses, like shoals of fish. The colour of the sea changed with the blood from their bodies.
The Allied campaign under General Sir Ian Hamilton was cursed by poor coordination. As on the Western Front, the two sides dug into a bitter trench war.
The morale of his troops has sunk so low as to be beyond description. These fellows will eventually have to embark their troops and remove them one of these nights.
On the 20th of December 1915, they did just that. Turkish officer İzzettin Bey was woken by the duty officer at 3 o'clock in the morning.
They had spotted many frigates and military transport ships. They thought it was a new invasion, but on the contrary, the British were running away. Their situation had become hopeless.
After 9 terrible months, the hills of Gallipoli fell silent. Both sides had suffered around 250,000 casualties.
250,000 casualties. For what? I just don't understand. I don't understand why and for what reason. And then what happens? Our soldiers, they end up at their own beach and they get butchered by the Turks. Just try to imagine how these young kids, because they were kids, how they felt. And they could see their mates just falling like dominos next to them. And they were pushed towards those bullets, towards the enemy lines. Can you just imagine coming out of the sea? We're going to have a look at this story a little bit later on. But now, I just want to ask why. I don't know. I can't understand some things. These kids, they gave their lives, not only the First World War, but in the Second as well, and the Vietnam War. And even in modern wars like Iraq and Afghanistan, So these kids, they give their lives for us so we can have our freedom and we can live in our comforts. So my question is why? Why today's politicians, for example, they're closing down 3 of our car manufacturing plants and they're putting out of work almost, they say, 200,000 people. I just don't understand. Is this why these young kids gave their lives for? So are today's Australians not to have a job to go to? Let's have a look at this story.
This number represents the amount of jobs the production of this car created for ordinary Australians like you and me. Whereas this directly creates 50,000 full-time jobs in Australia and indirectly supports the jobs and families of 200,000 Australians. Holden was the first Australian-designed and mass-produced car, and it's proud to be Australian. Our government invests only $18 per person every year in order to support Australia's manufacturing industry. That's 12 times less than the US and 20 times less than Sweden. And it pales in comparison to the subsidies the government gives to mining. Even though the mining industry generates 1/4 as many jobs, that's a small price to pay. Without it, an industry worth $21 billion to the Australian economy will collapse.
Okay, so an imported car will give jobs to 5 Australians. But a company like Holden, a manufacturer of cars here in Australia like Toyota, Holden or Ford, will give 50,000 jobs. And my question is, why did we lower the tariffs from 57% to a mere 5%? Why? So first, we lose Mitsubishi, and then this.
Good evening. First tonight, the end of the line. Victoria's manufacturing industry in crisis, with Ford pulling the plug on its local operations.
The flow-on effects not only into the auto component industry, the local communities in both Broadmeadows and Geelong are going to be in serious trouble.
We will make sure that you are not left behind. The government will be providing.
How are they going to be providing for us? How? By borrowing more money. Then after the Labor, we had a change of government. The Liberals get in. And the problem continues.
Holden has confirmed the worst fears of thousands of South Australians, announcing it will leave our shores by 2017.
I don't have to tell anybody in the room here or listening on television that this is an incredibly difficult day for everybody at Holden, given our long and proud history of building cars in Australia.
In 10 years' time, I suppose people will ask who the Prime Minister was at the time we lost the automotive industry. And they'll remember it was Tony Abbott.
It's a sad day for manufacturing in Australia.
What are Australians going to be doing in the future?
Prime Minister Tony Abbott and his government have shown a callous disregard for these workers and their families. By cutting funding to this industry, by the outrageous remarks that have been made throughout the course of this week, they have driven Holdens out of this country.
So we lost Holden. It's gone. You would just think that with just one car manufacturer, without any competition, we should be able to keep Toyota. Toyota makes this beautiful car. We saw it in previous episodes, the Toyota Camry Hybrid, probably the best car we ever made. So wouldn't you think that we could just keep Toyota?
Nearly 3,000 direct jobs will go, but up to 200,000 jobs in wider support industries are now said to be at risk.
We've always made it crystal clear that within the parameters of the policy that we took to the election, we wanted to keep the car industry, both Holden and Toyota, going in this country. Holden have announced they're not going to stay past 2017. The challenge now is to ensure that Toyota continue manufacturing in this country. It's important to remember that Toyota have a different business model to Holden. The Toyota business model is based much more on exports than Holden's was in recent times. I'm very hopeful that the integration of Toyota into the global operations of the company means that it can have a strong and prosperous future in this country. The challenge now is to ensure, as far as we reasonably can, that Toyota stays, and that's what we're working on now.
So they're promising us that they try to keep at least Toyota. Now, you would just think that Toyota will stay in Australia after spending $350 million upgrading their factory to the state of the art. And on top of that, we're making now our own hybrid engines.
This is the home of Toyota in Australia, a mini city on the outskirts of Melbourne. It's a vast plant. Mark Taylor and Chris Harrod, both long-serving Toyota employees, are part of the driving force behind a $330 million upgrade.
Fundamentally, the whole factory was gutted, and I mean gutted.
The original engine plant was built in 1978.
The roof was taken off, the side walls were taken off. Basically, we rebuilt the plant from the outside.
A Toyota car definitely starts off with a bang. This is press. Weld is one of the big guns at the Toyota Australia plant, and it's robot central. Back at the paint shop, the cleaned and sealed primed bodies are ready to be transformed. It has been an incredible journey, a dream that started in Japan with the humble weaving loom. The first Toyota was followed by dozens of models of cars and trucks. Toyota soon became part of the Australian landscape. This mega factory is now weaving its own place into Toyota's history. A factory which houses its own stamping, unit, weld, paint, resin and assembly plants. And now, a first for Toyota Australia, local hybrid engine production. It started with a simple invention and a dream to build a car for the people.
I would like to thank National Geographic for providing us with that footage. Let's see what happens next.
Toyota has announced it will cease making cars and engines in Australia by 2017.
That's it. It's all wiped out. 3 car manufacturing companies, they couldn't stay in Australia. And our politicians on both sides, they couldn't keep them here. Have a look again at this.
The challenge now is to ensure, as far as we reasonably can, that Toyota stays, and that's what we're working on now.
We have now had to make the painful decisions. The end of production of cars by the end of 2017.
This number represents the amount of jobs the production of this car created for ordinary Australians like you and me. Whereas this directly creates 50,000 full-time jobs in Australia and indirectly supports the jobs and families of 200,000 Australians.
So my question, and perhaps a question for many thousands, hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of Australians, is why? Why? We watched earlier how 250,000 lives were lost in the Battle of Gallipoli. But let's have a look and see what happened after the Allied forces withdraw from Gallipoli. The Turks were hungry for revenge. Let's have a look and see what happened.
The Greek genocide came about during a period in which the Ottoman Empire was crumbling. Making matters worse, the Turks sided with the Germans in the First World War, in which it lost. The elite in the Ottoman Empire during that period were the Greeks and Armenians, who controlled the economy and trade, and its citizens held the most important positions in society. Following the First World War, Mustafa Kemal, a Turkish general who had helped lead his nation to victory in the Anzac campaign against Australia and New Zealand troops in 1915, was asked to disarm the Turkish army in the east of the country. Instead of disarming them, he reorganised them with the aim of ousting Greece, who in May of 1919 were sent to the east of Turkey by a mandate of the British to occupy Smyrna, known today as Izmir. The Greeks were sent to Smyrna mainly because it was inhabited by a large number of Greeks and also to protect them from further massacre by the Turks. During the next 2 years, Mustafa Kemal and his nationalists committed numerous outrages, particularly in the eastern region. One of the first genocides in the 20th century was the genocide of the Greeks, Armenians and Assyrians. Greek genocide is the term used by modern genocide scholars to describe the violent campaign instigated against the Greek subjects of Ottoman Turkey by 2 consecutive governments of the former Ottoman Empire, the Committee for Union and Progress, better known as the Young Turks, and the nationalist Kemalists led by Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. The campaign included massacres, forced deportations including death marches, summary expulsions, arbitrary executions, and destruction of Christian Orthodox cultural, historical and religious monuments. In October of 2011, independent Senator Nick Xenophon called on the Australian government to recognise the Greek, Armenian and Assyrian genocides.
I rise to speak tonight on an issue that is sensitive for many reasons. From 1915 to 1923, the Armenian, Greek and Assyrian people were the victims of one of the first modern genocides. The exact figures are not known, but it is estimated that over 3.5 million people died as a result of deliberate, systematic actions by the Ottoman Empire. The Armenian, Greek and Assyrian people endured forced marches into the desert with little or no food or water and imprisonment in so-called relocation camps, which were effectively concentration camps. Ottoman troops also massacred countless victims in vicious attacks on cities and local villages, which included mass drownings, burnings and poisonings. The Republic of Turkey, which succeeded the Ottoman Empire, does not recognise these events as genocide.
Australia has yet to recognise the Greek genocide. However, there have been a number of MPs and senators who have risen in Parliament, calling for an official recognition. Currently, the genocide still remains unrecognised by Australia.
While the Allies are fighting, they were in Gallipoli against the Turks. Let's have a look and see what happened in other parts of the Balkans. And let's have a look at Serbia. At that particular time, Serbia is just losing the war against the Austrian and Hungarians and also the Bulgarians. The Serbian army and many Serbian civilians have been forced to evacuate Serbia. And they moved southwest to Albania. And then from there, French ships transport the remains of the Serb army to the Greek island of Corfu. Corfu lost its perpetual neutrality by helping the Serbians to recruit. A year later, 130,000 Serbian soldiers sent to Thessaloniki for a final attempt to free their country. So while they started together, the Serbians took the road back to the country. The Greek army separated from the Serbs, and a year later, they started the offensive into Turkey, always with the motivation of the British command. Let's have a quick look at the story.
In mid-June 1920, London approaches Greek Prime Minister Venizelos for help in defeating the Turkish nationalists, who have even begun to attack British troops in Istanbul. The Allies agree to let Greek forces advance from Izmir into Turkey, and on June 22nd, the invasion begins. By the following year, Greek troops have advanced deep into Turkish territory. An exultant Lloyd George proclaims, "Turkey is no more." But the Turks themselves aren't convinced. Kemal plans to use the same strategy employed by the Russians against Napoleon in 1812. Draw the enemy into the interior, wear them down, and then counterattack. In July, King Constantine of Greece takes personal command of his forces in Turkey and strikes in a brilliant attack that drives the enemy back toward Ankara. Kemal and his second-in-command, İsmet İnönü, pull their troops back to within 50 miles of Ankara and build a strong defensive position
along the Sakarya River, with concentric rings of trenches. In late August, Constantine's army attacks again, driving the Turks back at the rate of a mile per day. The two sides fight savagely for weeks. Then Kemal sends his cavalry to attack the exposed Greek supply lines. Constantine fears that his army may be surrounded. With his troops exhausted and his supply base 350 miles away, Constantine decides to fall back. After several days of brutal combat, the Greek army retreats. Athens appeals urgently to Lloyd George for military assistance. But the British Prime Minister can do nothing, replying that he is one of 3 people in London who support the Greek occupation. At Izmir, a fleet of ships hastily assembles to evacuate the defeated Greek army. Masses of soldiers, as well as thousands of Greek civilians, are taken aboard a hodgepodge of ships from a variety of countries as the Turkish army continues to advance. In the midst of this chaos, a fire breaks out in the city and quickly spreads. About half of Izmir is destroyed as thousands die in the flames. As the Turkish army moves closer to Istanbul, the British decide to negotiate after all. General Charles Harrington arranges a truce.
This is the end of another episode of This is Australia. I know this one here was different, but I had to tell the story. I think that we have to ask questions. Why those things happening around us? I mean, it's not just our car industry that just died, disappeared. It's a lot of our manufacturing industries that they're all gone. And that makes me upset. It makes me angry. Because these young kids gave their lives for us, for you and me, for all of us. And look what's happening around us. It's very sad. But anyway, I think that's the end of this episode. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next week.